Welcome to the Lost Ways of Knowing podcast. Your host is Matthew Krebs, religious scholar, philosopher, and co-founder of Circle Yoga Shala. The Lost Ways of Knowing teaches a basic history of the Indian traditions that are central to modern yoga. If you're a yoga teacher or practitioner, you must listen for a clear, concise, and provocative engagement with how this history might apply to today's world. The ultimate aim of this podcast is to initiate a dialogue about awakening and overcoming self-deception, leading to deeper intimacy with what is real. Matthew's coming to you from his home, Circle Yoga Shala, which is also a working farm and yoga teacher, yoga therapy training facility.
Welcome, everybody. In our discussion of enlightenment and meaning and purpose and wisdom, we're looking at those things from the perspective of the ancient yoga traditions and placing those traditions in dialogue with modern ideas that come from the disciplines of cognitive psychology and philosophy. So let's make a summary of last time. So if you're just now joining us, you'll kind of have an idea about where we are. Last time we began our conversation about enlightenment with an open admission that we may indeed be confused about what it is. But we also have to admit that we have intuitions about it that are real, even though these intuitions are couched in a self-conscious understanding that we don't exactly know what we're talking about. We recognize enlightenment as something valuable, and so the intuitions themselves are real. Also, as practitioners of yoga, we understand that all the techniques and principles and philosophies that come in its various traditions aim in the direction of this really profound transformation called enlightenment. So rather than trying to establish an axiomatic kind of definition of enlightenment, last time we identified it as a qualitative transformation, a kind of transformation that transcends mere psychological modification, where, because it's so deep, it transforms the deepest layer of our values and desires. In that sense, awakening itself can be considered a unique species of value. So because yoga practice is ultimately oriented by enlightenment, it's likewise working in the area of value realization or value acquisition. Last time we saw that the work of value realization requires a specific kind of agency, primarily because one cannot simply choose to transform oneself at any significant level of depth. Calling on the work of Dr. Agnes Callard, we identified the unique species of agency involved in value acquisition as aspirational agency. When we aspire toward a value like awakening or enlightenment, we do not as of yet fully grasp its significance. We do, however, imperfectly recognize its significance. So to aspire is to exist in a kind of liminal space where we have a vague understanding that something calls us toward the acquisition of a new value, like radical self-transcendence. But at the same time, we don't exactly know what this means fully, because we have to pass through the transformative experience in order to fully understand who we will be on the other side. When we do the work of aspiration, we're being called to fertilize and grow our love for what is real and for what is meaningful. And this podcast is essentially about how yoga is one of the great offerings to the world in the service of loving what is real and meaningful more and more. Well, this time we're talking about contemporary definitions of enlightenment. So that means we're looking at some things that have been said by contemporary teachers who are still alive or teachers who have lived in our lifetime. And these things are added to the conversation in order to flesh out this general idea of value realization or value acquisition. Now, there are many ideas about what enlightenment is. Some come from the dogma of particular schools, but many come from autodidactic renegade teachers who are only loosely associated with a particular school. And sometimes their teachings explicitly rebel against the dogma of a particular school. These contemporary teachers in this list are those who are very important to the Shala in some way. And this list is gleaned from Marianna Caplan's very valuable book, Halfway Up the Mountain, The Error of Premature Claims to Enlightenment. The first teacher is Georg Feuerstein. He's a very important practitioner and researcher of yoga, who I myself discovered some 30 years ago. He was a Sanskrit speaker and a scholar who was also a devoted practitioner. So he was someone who moved in spiritual circles and lived and practiced in ashrams, trying to realize the significance of the things that he was studying. So this means he wasn't only qualified academically, he was deeply invested in these traditions. So he had skin in the game, as we say. And it's very important that when we listen to things of an academic nature, that we make sure that some of those things come from people who were earnestly trying to realize them in life. Feuerstein has written many books, perhaps the most famous being the Encyclopedia of Yoga, which came out more than 30 years ago. I really think it's still relevant today in the way that it outlines the development of the philosophies and the techniques and the traditions that make up yoga. Feuerstein says that, quote, enlightenment is the shattering of all mental constructs. So let's flesh this idea out a little bit. What is the shattering of mental constructs? One of the metaphors that could be used to illustrate the nature of a mental construct is a pair of glasses that have lenses that are colored in a certain way. Well, before enlightenment, we don't really know that we're wearing glasses. So everything appears in the color that they add to our perceptions, and we simply assume that this is the way it is. If awakening is the shattering of all mental constructs, then it's like realizing that we're wearing glasses and taking them off for the first time. This experience destroys the habitual conditioned perceptions and responses that the glasses generate. Everything appears now without their color. So the awakening event makes us aware that we've been wearing glasses for a long time and that we have been perceiving a highly conditioned version of reality. It also means that we now have the option to keep the glasses off, or if they actually help us see better, we can put them back on, but with the knowledge now that we're wearing them. The next definition is from Lee Loswick. Lee was a very important teacher and is affectionately known as Mr. Lee in many circles. He was the teacher of one of our dearest mentors, Red Hawk, whose work is really central to everything we do at the Shala. Mr. Lee says, enlightenment is responsiveness. So being awake is here correlated with a certain kind of action, namely the ability to do what is needed in each moment or to generate a wise response. Enlightenment is then synonymous with a new degree of responsibility. In this new space, we're free from rigid agendas that limit the way we interact with reality. When one is free from dogmatic agendas, one is open to respond to anything that arises with skill and sensitivity. So when one lives in responsiveness rather than in reaction or projection, there's a kind of freshness to our actions, an implicit creativity. And this in turn also looks like spontaneity. Spontaneity is certainly one of the characteristics that's classically ascribed to the awakened masters in many, many traditions. I'm thinking in particular of Taoism and its emphasis on this. Next, we have something from the famous French teacher Arnaud Desjardins. He says, enlightenment is a relaxed mind. Desjardins also calls this accepting everything in the moment as it is without trying to change it. At the Shala, this is called the practice of non-interference, wherein we meet what is arising with a kind of affection, or what we often call the big yes. In this orientation, we're really interested in understanding what is happening rather than judging or manipulating it. And in particular, our knowledge of what is arising is always grounded in an awareness of sensation and feeling. As Red Hawk would say, we encounter reality free from judgment when we receive it below the neck. In this sensory-rich state, which we call presence, we practice relaxing any impulse that tries to change what is arising. In another way, this is simply the practice of non-attachment. This idea of non-attachment brings up a common question from students. After they hear that being awake is contingent on being free from attachment and consequently free from the desire to manipulate things, a fear tends to arise in young students, which assumes that to be an accomplished yogi or yogini means that we won't want anything at all. This fear is very instructive because it shows that the everyday ego is composed largely of the fear that its desires will not be fulfilled. It is very common to feel as though genuine satisfaction can only be realized when all my desires have been fulfilled. So with this in mind, what does being free from desire and attachment, or embodying a relaxed mind, really mean? Because we're ultimately talking about yoga, we should try to answer this question by referencing the Bhagavad Gita, which is a central text for a majority of the traditions in India and also a fundamental cornerstone here at the Shala. In the 55th shloka of the second chapter, Prince Arjuna, who is the main character, asks Lord Krishna about the qualities of the wise. He says, "How does one describe him who is steady of wisdom, who is steadfast in meditation, Krishna? How does he who is steady in wisdom speak? How does he sit? How does he move?" Krishna responds in the next sloka by telling the prince that wisdom is steady in one who has, quote, abandoned all desires emerging from the mind. Well, let's look at this. The Sanskrit word for mind in this example is monogatun. The root of this word is manas, which generally refers to the lower mind or the sense mind. So it's not all desire really that is to be abandoned in the pursuit of wisdom. It is rather a certain class of desires, those that emerge from the sense mind, that region of the mind composed of sight, sound, taste, touch, smell, and also speaking, grasping, moving, procreating, and eliminating. This level of mind, this sense mind, in itself is devoid of genuine intelligence and intuition. And so it's really more like a reactive slave to pleasure and pain. It is not, as Desjardins has advised, relaxed as a matter of course. This level of mind, the sense mind, in itself is devoid of genuine intelligence and intuition. It is thus a reactive slave to pleasure and pain. It is not, as Desjardins advises, relaxed as a matter of course. The senses really find their true usefulness when they are guided by the higher levels of mind. And that would be active intelligence, intuition, and essential bliss. We can surmise then that desires emerging from these higher levels are not problematic in the same way, or at least to the same degree. Now, the Gita does not go on to list specific desires arising from the lower mind that inhibit wisdom. This really would require listing an endless list of sense objects that correlate with foolishness. What the Gita does, rather, is reveal 3 predictable outcomes which signal that it is wise to abandon any particular desire or object that produces these outcomes when that desire is frustrated. These outcomes are known as the 3 poisons. They are anger, greed, and fear. So if we want to know which desires specifically can be abandoned in order to increase the possibility of embodying a relaxed mind, anytime the desire for X is frustrated or fails to reach consummation, and anger, fear, or greed arise, it may be wise to let that desire go.
Looking for a yoga teacher training that goes beyond poses? At Circle Yoga Shala, our 200 and 300-hour programs are immersive journeys into somatic awareness, spiritual depth, and authentic teaching. Rooted in ancient wisdom and modern insight, these trainings are designed to transform your practice and your life. Learn more and apply at circleyogashala.com, where yoga isn't performance, it's presence.
We have something else here from Lee Loswick and also a student of his named Purna Steinitz. Enlightenment is the knowledge that all things are transitory, including enlightenment. So this is essentially a teaching about impermanence. Knowledge of this means accepting at a deep level that things come and go. This really is one of the central teachings of all of the wisdom traditions. Trying to hold on to things that are transitory is really foolish, like trying to hold water in your hand or trying to catch the wind. Both of those are images of foolish attachment, which produces a continuous sense of frustration that ends up being a kind of madness if the nature of this error is not seen. I want you to take a second to try and actively imagine living and acting from a place where all of our choices emerge from a deep knowledge that things are transitory, even enlightenment itself. So there's a twist here. Knowledge of impermanence itself has to be taken as transitory. So there isn't any concept or any epistemological construct that doesn't go. So ultimately, these kinds of things are not worth investing in too much. When we understand that impermanence is the law, and we begin to see things as being in constant flux in a really, really deep way, like slowly melting wax near a flame, then we're really beginning to awaken. But this awakening does not entail residing in a space that is free from change. This also means that awakening is coincident with existing in a kind of exquisite vulnerability, which means that awakening involves the heart in a crucial way. When knowledge of impermanence is seated in the heart, true transformation of our tendency toward foolish attachment begins. The state of being seated in the heart is called by many of our teachers radical surrender. It's understood to be a mixture of gratitude and compassion. That means radical surrender is a sense of fullness that compels thanksgiving and sharing, and at the same time, a profound willingness to suffer with others. Next, we have something from the great Dr. Carl Jung, the transpersonal psychologist, genius interpreter of myth and of the alchemical traditions, origin of the idea of the collective unconscious, and teacher of the active imagination as the essence of transpersonal therapy. Jung said, enlightenment is an impersonal energy. So the power that runs this process of awakening lies beyond the reach of me and mine, beyond the reach of what our beloved teacher Red Hawk would call me, myself, or the ego personality. Marianna Caplan comments on this, quote, one does not experience the energy of enlightenment because of one's good deeds or because of one's extraordinary nature. The moment of enlightenment is an unemotional force, indifferent to personalities and personal preferences, and this force uses the most suitable human vehicle to fulfill its needs, unquote. Now, let's be precise here. Though Caplan emphasizes that the force that runs awakening is unemotional and impersonal in her way of saying, I think it's important to understand that this doesn't mean waking up happens without feeling. Feeling is different from emotion. Technically, emotion is more of a mechanical, automatic event. If you look inside the word emotion, you find motion. And this emphasizes that emotions always initiate an action program that involuntarily changes a person's observable posture. So when emotional, some people become strangely still, some people immediately shift their position, most everyone's facial expression changes, and so on. In this way, emotions could be called a public phenomenon. And this is why others often know our emotional reactions much better than we do, because they are literally unfolding in real time without our conscious participation. By contrast, feelings are private. They reside in our inner world. For example, anger is an emotion that overtakes us without our consent most of the time. When this happens, our jaw tightens, our pulse rate increases, our temperature rises. But all of this happens without our conscious participation. The feeling of anger arises when I realize that all of this is happening to me, and I begin to consciously experience it and participate in it in a certain way. The qualities of this conscious experience are not public. Others don't know our feelings unless we share them. Given Jung and Caplan's emphasis, because awakening transcends the personal ego, it transcends the realm of mechanical emotional reactions, and it genuinely moves in the realm of feeling. Likewise, ego transcendence grants the possibility of disidentification from emotional reactions, which does not interfere with them directly, but facilitates their transmutation into conscious feeling in a way that fertilizes the sensitivity of our organism. So now we can see that Caplan's use of the term unemotional to describe the state of enlightenment actually indicates a space of profound sensitivity, where one's capacity for feeling, and therefore a deep intimacy with one's inner experience, actually expands. I believe Jung would agree with this analysis, as he is known to have said that most of our psychic problems stem from a malfunction in our feeling mechanism. One last thing. This impersonal space of non-identification can also be understood as a kind of objectivity. Objectivity as a sensitive space of deep feeling is very interesting because it has a dual meaning in this context. When our objectivity is turned toward ourselves and our own process, it's called humility. When it's turned toward others, it's called compassion. The next idea is from Roshi Joan Halifax. She's the headmaster at Upaya Zen Monastery in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Roshi Halifax said that enlightenment is the realization of connectedness. This is a classic perspective on enlightenment, and an element of this is common across both theistic and non-theistic contemplative traditions. This is the recognition that the average everyday state, what the yoga tradition would call avidya or ignorance, is manifest as a conviction that we are separate, self-sustaining, autonomous beings. With this conviction comes a selfish set of emotions, feelings, and actions which perpetuate and entrench the original conviction of separateness and the suffering that it tends to cause. This orientation toward our experience in life has many pernicious consequences, but one could sum them up very simply. When we believe and act as if we're separate, we don't realize that everything we do to, quote, other things is simultaneously something that we do to ourselves. So we're kind of forced into an adversarial or consumer or instrumental relationship with the rest of reality, where nature and other people and our relations get treated simply as means for my own ends. By contrast, in the realization of connectedness, nature is also me, and other people are also me. And since it seems like madness to mistreat or neglect myself, it is madness to do the same to any of my relations. So to be awakened is to understand myself as deeply related or interconnected with all things. As my first teacher was very fond of saying, none of this is mine, I am responsible for it. Here's something from another great teacher of Zen, Mel Weitzman. Quote, "Enlightenment is the realization that you know nothing." Well, this really makes me think of Socrates, who in many people's estimation was the greatest philosopher who ever lived. So what's interesting is that Socrates was considered to be the wisest precisely because of the fact that he was acutely conscious of his own ignorance. He was too wise to be certain, so his intelligence was always turned toward optimizing the process of inquiry in which he was engaged, and he was transformed continuously by evaluating and improving the method by which he came to certain realizations. So rather than being overly concerned with the ends toward which he reasoned, he was constantly looking at the assumptions of the arguments he encountered, constantly inquiring into what he himself had identified with, and constantly paying attention to how he was paying attention. If enlightenment then is the realization that we know nothing, it can't be equated with knowledge. Any enlightenment that is equated with knowledge is rightly called conceptual enlightenment. And it is something about which teachers continuously warn us. Conceptual enlightenment is a kind of educated, erudite knowledge of what a transformational experience is without actually having gone through one. Or it is having gone through an experience that is potentially transformative, but to have misunderstood it and therefore failed to integrate it, precisely because of an orientation toward it and oneself that is conceptual in nature or abstract in nature. This kind of orientation actually blocks genuine transformation. Here's something else from the great transpersonal psychologist Charles Tart. Quote, "Enlightenment is more easily recognized through understanding one's endarkenment." The yoga tradition shares this emphasis on sharpening awareness of the things that hinder our awakening. For instance, if we look at the Bhagavad Gita, we see that there can be no wisdom and ultimately no love without coming to terms with the powerful unconscious forces that compel us, which are called the gunas. And these things generally mask as genuine agency or masquerade as genuine agency. If Tart is right, when we aspire in the direction of enlightenment, we would do well to shift our focus from ideas of the goal toward the persistent patterns of avoidance and attachment that are hidden in our word and our thoughts and our deeds and our emotional reactions. This means the process of awakening largely involves repeated encounters with bad habits and then getting to the root of those. In Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, the roots of our selfish bad habits are called klesha. Klesha means hindrance or affliction. The kleshas define a set of conditions that determine a set of common impulses which are rooted deeply in us, and these produce unreflective mechanical desires and behaviors. There are 5 kleshas: ignorance, ego possessiveness, attraction or attachment, revulsion, and the fear of death. There are a lot of important details about each one of these, but for the purposes of brevity, we construct a sentence for our students that sums up their influence. Quote, "When I act as if I know, and I really don't, I come here to take what is mine, to experience only pleasure, to avoid all pain, in the hope that I won't die." So when we really aspire toward awakening via coming to terms with our endarkenment, we're actually doing self-correction in response to a very reliable set of mistakes that we continue to make. In this sense, our mistakes are the most important things that we encounter in the spiritual journey, because they, more than anything else, guide our course correction. This is especially true if we're working with teachers and other practitioners who share a protocol where dialogue, inquiry, and reflection are sincerely practiced. If we're willing to make correction based on this shared protocol, we're willing to inquire and dialogue and reflect, then our mistakes won't tend to be catastrophic. That is, they won't tend to derail the whole project. They'll tend to be things that are very important for us to understand and actually teach us something. Here's something else from Arnaud Desjardins. Quote, "Enlightenment has degrees. So in this way, you can think of it as existing on a continuum. This means there are many enlightenments, medium level events, really big transformative events, and also that the experience of these things is not necessarily a linear kind of progression. So in our experience at the Shala, this seems very, very sober, very realistic. By contrast, the idea of a one and done, where we realize something very important and boom, we're free forever. No more ignorance, no more self-centeredness. This really seems much less likely, though, I can't deny that these things may indeed happen. It just doesn't seem as likely because epiphanies can really feel life-changing, but they tend to fade very quickly. So mere mortals like us will tend to experience an extended non-linear process composed of punctuated, very powerful events, along with less intense epiphanies, and also plateaus or periods of dormancy. In this regard, Marianna Caplan points out that, quote, "The Zen tradition makes a clear distinction between shallow and deep enlightenment. It claims that while it's possible for the awakening event to penetrate individuals so profoundly as to produce a radical change in every aspect of their expression, very often initial enlightenment is more shallow and it needs to be stabilized and deepened over time." Here's something again from Charles Tart. Quote, "Enlightenment is freedom from the spiritual path." So the rigors and constraints of various traditions can be helpful in facilitating a degree of commitment and sacrifice that is initially helpful on the journey. But with the advent of the genuine article of awakening, the specifics of any given tradition are transcended. Now, it may be the case that awakened individuals decide to remain practitioners of their native tradition. Even if this happens, there is freedom from these constraints in that they have served their purpose and they're no longer necessary. But even more than this, the awakened individual is free from the trappings of identifying with a tradition to the extent that the tradition subsumes the core of her identity. So awakening is really freedom from attachment to any spiritual persona or image that comes with any particular spiritual path. Every time I contemplate someone who's completely identified with the image of what a particular tradition assumes one should be, I think of a poem by the great Sufi master Kabir. This is called The Spiritual Athlete, and it's an image of someone who is deeply committed to a path in that they really look the part, but nonetheless, they are deeply lost. The spiritual athlete often changes the color of his clothes, and his mind remains gray and loveless. He sits inside a shrine room all day so that God has to go outdoors and pray to the rocks. Or he drills holes in his ears, his hair grows enormous and matted. People mistake him for a goat. He goes out into wilderness areas, strangles his impulse, and makes himself neither male nor female. He shaves his skull, puts his robe in an orange vat. He reads the Bhagavad Gita and becomes a terrific talker. Kabir says, actually, you are going in a hearse to the country of death, bound hand and foot. Now, I'm guessing that some of those definitions of awakening may be unusual because most people in various contemplative or self-actualization circles come to realize pretty quickly that they have a very firm sense of what enlightenment is. And teachers like these really show us that these assumptions, if not mistaken, may simply be naive. Let's conclude by saying a few things with regard to having naive assumptions about enlightenment. One of the greatest misconceptions is thinking that enlightenment will be something like happiness. Now, we can't assume that awakening involves no element of happiness whatsoever. However, it seems a bit naive given the magnitude of self-sacrifice and suffering manifested in the lives of the saints and the lives of the great gurus to think of enlightenment as a simple intensification of our pleasure-seeking function. In this vein, Marianna Caplan says, if we knew what enlightenment was, we would run from it. Indeed, from the accounts of many, many of the great masters, reality or enlightenment is not the heavenly salvation that most people hoped it would be. There is tremendous suffering in reality, in addition to the joy that is there. And the enlightened vision sees all of it just as it is, unable to defend against any aspect of it. This is why it's often said that rather than happiness, the saints actually receive something called the gift of tears. These tears are the compassionate, awakened response to a clear, unmediated vision of reality. Remember that in the quote above, Marianna Caplan equated enlightenment with reality itself. And so when enlightened, no aspect of what is real can be excluded. Everything will touch us. Everything will be felt deeply. So we should take great care not to let the idea of awakening become too intermingled with notions of conventional happiness. Caplan reiterates this, quote, "If most people understood that instead of swimming in an ocean of bliss, their enlightenment would mean a life of heartbreak, a life of service and suffering on behalf of other people, many people would leave the path before they ever began." Now, I'm not trying to curb your enthusiasm if you are one of those who are called toward radical self-transcendence. Let's just not be naive. Now, our work at the Shala really unfolds in relation to all of these ideas. Given all that's been said, we're well aware of how pretentious it is to speak of enlightenment from the unenlightened state. Nevertheless, awakening is the orienting metaphor for everything that we do, and wisdom is a place at which we arrive along the way. So we exist and work in an aspirational relationship with the nature and value of awakening. And we self-consciously reason and act from a conscious knowledge of our imperfect grasp of the value that enlightenment manifests. This is what it's like to be genuinely called to self-transcend. And in particular, we hold very dear Charles Tart's conviction that enlightenment is more easily recognized through understanding our endarkenment. Though our method is called self-remembering and self-observation, these two things go together like two sides of a coin. What does this specifically mean? It means we're trying to move in a way that systematically overcomes egocentricity, a way that opens the heart through the practice of open-mindedness, service, the cultivation of humility, the strengthening of concentration, and the ability to remain present. This is the way we're committed to understanding wisdom and its place in the awakening process. Our teacher Red Hawk has, in a provocative sense, called what we do the way of failure. So we could sum it up by saying we learn through practice to fail in a way that is very constructive. So let's make a summary. If we take all of the ideas about awakening from above, we can see that when awakened, we are freed from habitual mental constructs. We are responsive and spontaneous. We have a relaxed mind, and in our hearts, we rest in the knowledge that all things in this world are transitory. Awakening is animated and driven by an impersonal energy that seems to have its own agenda, and we also know that we know nothing. We should endeavor, therefore, to remain unattached, even to the specifics of spiritual practice itself, all the while continuing to engage in those specifics. We should be very careful that we don't conflate enlightenment with the popular fantasy that it means the end of all of our problems or the end of all of our suffering or something just like simple happiness. It's also important to remember that wisdom becomes a focus more and more and more in this discussion, because whereas it's really difficult to speak of enlightenment, wisdom is within our grasp. I want to thank you for listening. God bless all of you, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Lost Ways of Knowing podcast. We hope it was informative and also inspiring for you. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcast and leave a review for us so other yoga teachers and practitioners can find us. For in-person opportunities to learn and grow in a community setting, visit circleyogashala.com.